Well, it's time now for a look at what's making the front pages around the world in our international press review with Elena Casas. Hello, Elena.
Hello again, Lorna.
Right, so we're going to start off, we mentioned it earlier in the news bulletin, but the Qantas strike has been making headlines around the world, but it certainly dominates the press over in Australia.
Well, for us here in Europe, it might just be an inconvenience to a few thousand stranded passengers, but for the Australian press, it's a major national disaster. Have a look at this front page from the Sydney Morning Herald. Crisis grips nation is their headline, and the editorial says that, of course, Australia is an island, so for them this is a national emergency. You can't get on and off of Australia without having airlines, of course, and Qantas flies 1 in 5 passengers that go to or from Australia. They blame the Prime Minister, Julia Gillard, for talks breaking down this weekend. They say she could have issued a ministerial decree forcing Qantas employees to go back to work and didn't. If we have a look at the map that there is in there, we can see just how many people have been affected in Australia. There's not many people on that map stranded in Europe, but there are 15,000 stuck at Sydney Airport and 10,000 each in Brisbane and Melbourne. So you can see the impact there has been quite big, and also that's a lot of disgruntled voters if all those stranded people follow the paper in blaming Julia Gillard.
Indeed. Well, let's move on to Syria. That's another big focus for international headlines today. And Newsweek magazine has been speaking to an army defector in Syria.
My superior would say to all of us, let's go hunting birds and then go up onto rooftops and shoot teenage protesters in the head. That's part of the shocking testimony, or, upsetting at least, testimony of a former Syrian soldier who's spoken to Newsweek magazine. He's now working for a defectors organisation called the Free Syrian Army in Lebanon, which has bothered the Assad regime enough that they carried out a cross-border incursion about a month ago to try and kill some of its members. He says that for them, the only alternative now is a civil war. They no longer believe in the ability of the international community or the Arab League to do anything to help them. They're collecting weapons and they plan to launch an armed insurrection, which is of course very worrying for the West.
Indeed, and in fact, the New York Times is asking today why more people aren't standing up for the for the Syrian protesters internationally on the international stage.
Yes, they're looking at Syrian intellectuals, especially writers and artists, of whom there are a lot living in exile in the West, but they haven't had much to say about the protests. The paper says, on the one hand, they may have a kind of interiorized censorship going on because they were constrained by the regime over what they were allowed to say for so long. Or on the other hand, they may also be very isolated from what's actually going on in their home countries. And also, of course, these protests across the Arab world have been so spontaneous and so youthful that perhaps older intellectuals haven't had much say, really. And the paper says they might even render the idea of having a kind of guiding ideology or leaders in this kind of movement irrelevant because they've been so spontaneously organised on the internet.
Well, we're going to stick with the Arab Spring and move to the UK paper, The Guardian, because they've been taking a look at what it's like living in post-Gaddafi Libya.
Well, one of its journalists was imprisoned in Tripoli in March. He did 2 weeks in solitary confinement, and now he's gone back to the prison where he was held and actually hunted down his jailer, the journalist called Gaith Abdul Attad, and we can see some rather foreboding pictures there of the cell that he was held in Libya. Now, he goes back and meets his jailer again, and he says he did torture people under Gaddafi, but he was only doing his job. He says that people like him are now being hunted down by the new regime, and also, of course, those people taking to the streets in Libya now to celebrate the NTC were waving green flags for Gaddafi just a few weeks ago. So it's hard to know, really, under the new facade, what real people in Tripoli actually think.
And finally, we're going to go to a law firm in New York State because they specialise in home foreclosures, don't they? But they had a Halloween party that went a little bit wrong.
Well, yes. I mean, if you were organising a Halloween party, rather, for a law firm that specialised in foreclosures, what fancy dress theme do you think you'd pick, Lorna?
Can't really think. I can only think of people turning up with for sale signs or something.
Well, you probably wouldn't pick homelessness, though, would you?
No.
No. But the firm of Stephen J. Baum in New York State did. We got some pictures here in the New York Times of its employees who came dressed as homeless people. The paper, of course, says this is incredibly insensitive. They've got big signs kind of joking about their homelessness, when, of course, this is a firm that's actually made quite a lot of people homeless.
Gosh, wow. Certainly a bit different anyway. Well, thank you very much indeed, Elena, for that look through the international newspapers this Monday.